2,000 years ago, in the city of Jerusalem, 12 men and their rabbi gathered together to celebrate the Jewish holiday of Passover. The rabbi was Jesus of Nazareth. The meal they shared has come to be known as the Last Supper. Perhaps no other gathering of 13 individuals has had such a powerful impact on the course of human history. Do we know the actual site where the Last Supper took place? Were there only men at this dinner? Or, as some suggest, were women present too? Is it possible that the world's most famous image of the Last Supper, painted by Leonardo da Vinci, is grossly inaccurate? And why did Judas, one of Jesus' inner circle, betray him? These are but a few of the mysteries of the Bible. "2,000 years ago, in the spring of a tumultuous year, Jews from every corner of ancient Israel made the pilgrimage to their holy city of Jerusalem to celebrate the holiday they called Passover. And so it was that a poor rabbi from Galilee began the arduous journey to reach Jerusalem, walking 6 days and 6 nights over rugged terrain. The name of the rabbi was Jesus of Nazareth. He came, followed by a loyal band of disciples, extolling a radical message that a new kingdom of God was at hand. The momentous events of Jesus' final week leading up to the Last Supper may never be fully understood, for no eyewitness accounts exist. The 4 Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, written several decades later, are the only chronicles which remain of his extraordinary life. They leave many baffling mysteries. What took place during the few brief hours of the Last Supper, which would forever alter the course of human history? Why, to share a simple meal with his disciples, did Jesus risk his life to enter a city occupied by hostile Roman legions? For Jesus, and every other Jew living under the harsh Roman occupation, the streets of this holiest of cities were filled with peril. Under the rule of Julius Caesar, the mighty Roman Empire had expanded its power all the way across the Mediterranean to dominate the Middle East and ancient Israel.
On the streets, you would see a Roman soldier and companions, and as a Jew, you would bristle. They represented really an occupying force. They were a constant reminder that the Jews were no longer an independent nation.
Why, in a political atmosphere fraught with tension, did the Roman occupiers allow the Jewish people to continue to worship their one all-powerful God and observe a Jewish holiday which celebrated freedom over oppression?
Remember this day, on which you went free from Egypt, the house of bondage, how the Lord freed you from it with a mighty hand. Exodus 13:13.
With these words, the Hebrew Bible commanded the Jewish people to not only remember, but also to relive the experience of the Exodus, their dramatic flight from Egyptian bondage 1,500 years earlier. Led by Moses across the Sinai wilderness, thousands of Hebrew slaves had reached Israel, the promised land and freedom. During the Roman occupation, an understanding had been reached with Jewish religious leaders, allowing the people to practice their faith under the watchful eye of Roman forces. But for Roman and Jew alike, the week of Passover was a volatile, dangerous time, threatening the precarious political balance.
The atmosphere with a crowded temple courts was rather like a tinderbox. People were celebrating freedom from imperial bondage while they were now again under imperial bondage.
Many people were looking for some form of deliverance from their Roman occupation. Some were expecting a great Messiah figure to appear. Others were thinking that God would intervene supernaturally on their behalf and send a cosmic judge from heaven to overthrow his enemies.
Shortly after his arrival in Jerusalem, Jesus visits the Holy Temple, the center of Jewish religious life. It is here that he performs his first revolutionary act. Historians still ask the question, why would Jesus choose this time and place to take a step which would seal his fate?
Jesus went to the temple and began to drive out all those who were buying and selling. He overturned the tables of the money changers and then taught the people, "It is written in the scriptures that God said, 'My temple will be called a house of prayer for the people of all nations, but you have turned it into a den of thieves.'" Mark 11:15.
By his disruption of the temple, Jesus threatens the existing order and becomes known as a dangerous political insurgent. What was the motive for his actions? Why did Jesus deliberately affront the most powerful authorities in the land?
What Jesus did was symbolically destroy the temple. It's similar to somebody in the 60s going into a draft office and overturning the draft cards. It doesn't really destroy the Pentagon. It's a symbolic act, destroying it ritually, as it were.
Could Jesus foresee that by his act of defiance he was putting his own life in jeopardy?
It was 2 days before the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. The chief priests and the scribes were looking for a way to arrest Jesus and kill him. For they said, "Not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people." Mark 14, too.
As Jesus readies for the holiday of Passover, others plot a dark conspiracy. Throughout the streets of Jerusalem, families are busily preparing for the Passover holidays. Following custom, celebrants select lambs for the sacrifice that will take place on the steps of the temple. It is in the midst of this holy occasion that a small group of conspirators hatch their plot. Scholars have been fascinated by the tantalizing question, did Jesus foresee his own death?
It doesn't have to be an indication of supernatural foreknowledge to recognize that he's in trouble. He's offended the temple authorities. He no doubt knows what happens to prophets who do things like this. Typically, they're arrested and often they're executed.
It is at this very moment that Jesus' destiny is being determined by an act that will go down in history as the most infamous betrayal of all time.
Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 disciples, went off to the chief priests in order to betray Jesus to them. They were pleased to hear what he had to say and promised to give him money. Mark 14:10.
Why did Judas go to the authorities? The motives for Judas's betrayal have long baffled historians.
If there's anything mysterious about that Last Supper, it may very well be the role of Judas. Who is he? Where does he come from? Really, we know very little.
While the New Testament indicates that Judas betrays Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, historians have questioned this motive because the financial gain he received was so small. Some scholars believe that Judas may have grown disillusioned with Jesus.
It's possible that Judas expected Jesus to be the Jewish Messiah of traditional expectation, that he would take up the sword, rouse the troops, and drive the Romans out of the land. When this didn't happen, that Judas became angry and out of frustration and bitterness turned Jesus over to the authorities.
Although the temple authorities are armed with incriminating evidence against Jesus, surprisingly, they do not arrest him. Instead, they bide their time, waiting for the right opportunity. On the morning of the Passover, the disciples ask where Jesus wants to celebrate the feast. He sends Peter and John off with strangely detailed instructions.
Go into town, and you will meet a man carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him, and say to the owner of the house to which he goes, "The master says, 'Where is the room for me to eat the Passover with my disciples?' And he will show you a large, upstairs room." Mark 14:12.
That night at sundown, Jesus and his followers gather for what has come to be known as the Last Supper, the holiest meal in the history of Christianity. For nearly 2,000 years, historians have attempted to solve the mystery of exactly where this dinner took place.
There's a tradition that one of Jesus' later followers, a man named John Mark, owned a house in Jerusalem. We know in the book of Acts that his mother owns a house, and it's possible that they were eating at the house of John Mark's mother.
Archaeologists have excavated the age-old streets of Jerusalem, sifting through evidence, hoping to find proof that this house existed. Although no one can say with certainty where the meal took place, a building on Mount Zion is believed by some to be the hallowed site. The Gothic building that stands on this spot dates from the 12th century. But at one time, an ancient dwelling occupied this site. Could this be the actual place where Jesus and his followers gathered for his last meal? Somewhere among the winding streets of ancient Jerusalem, Jesus and his disciples gather for what will become the most momentous meal in history. The event has haunted the human imagination for nearly 2,000 years. To this day, scholars are still struggling to reconstruct what actually happened in that room. According to the New Testament, 12 disciples were present at the table with Jesus. We know only a few of their names: Peter, James, John, Andrew, and Judas. For these individuals, the sharing of food had long played a surprisingly important role in their sense of common purpose.
Jesus, throughout his ministry, had meals with his disciples and with others. He shared table, which was a significant event. In the ancient world, sharing a meal with a person indicated a level of equality that you would have with the person. It wasn't just a matter of eating together, it was more of a social, almost a spiritual occasion.
The sharing of food embodied the idea, central to the teachings of Jesus, that all people are created equal in the eyes of God.
Jesus uses the meal, what I'd call the open table, as a symbol for the new society which he calls the kingdom of God. It's a table that does not discriminate between rich and poor, between female and male, between the haves and the have-nots, between the pure and the impure, between the slave and the free.
For Jews like Jesus and his companions, this night held a profound religious significance. For this was the Passover meal, or Seder, commemorating the Jewish liberation from Egyptian bondage. According to the story as recounted in Exodus, God had inflicted 10 terrible plagues on the Egyptian Pharaoh to break his will. During the 10th and most destructive plague, the killing of the Egyptian firstborn, God instructed the Israelites to mark their doors with lamb's blood.
I am the Lord. The blood on the doorposts will be a sign to mark houses in which you live. When I see the blood, I will pass over you and will not harm you when I punish the Egyptians. Exodus 12:12.
It was that night, as the wails of the Egyptian mothers mourning their firstborn echoed in the streets, that the Pharaoh agreed to let the Israelites go. Moses was finally able to lead his people out from centuries of bondage across the Red Sea towards their promised land. through this act of redemption, the Jews believed that God had re-established a covenant with the people of Israel. While most scholars agree that Jesus and his companions had gathered to commemorate the flight from Egypt, the most fundamental questions about that final meal remain unanswered. For hundreds of years, our vision of what actually took place has been shaped to a profound extent by a single work of art. Considered by many to be the world's most famous religious painting, this image, painted by Leonardo da Vinci in the late 15th century, still graces the wall of a monastery in Milan. But scholars have come to question the historical accuracy of da Vinci's masterpiece. Who among Jesus' companions actually attended the dinner? And how were they seated? Leonardo's painting depicts the disciples as seated upright behind a long table. But according to the Jewish custom, guests at a Seder would have been reclining on couches around a U-shaped table called a triclinium. And as for those present at the meal, Leonardo has chosen to portray only male disciples. At a Seder, women would have participated as well.
Women were among the disciples. They were among the inner circle. A family meal, a festival meal, which is what the Passover is, of course always had women. Women had a role. Women had a role in the prayers. So to the extent that it was a traditional meal, we assume that women were present.
Is it possible that women sat at the table with Jesus at this holiest of meals?
All our paintings, of course, show Jesus with 12 male companions. It is of great importance historically to ask, is that what Jesus did? Did he choose 12 men, and were those the only ones who were present at the Last Supper? I see absolutely no reason to presume that. The companions of Jesus were women and men at whatever final gathering there was.
Even the assumption that 12 individuals attended the dinner has come under scrutiny. Some scholars suggest that the number 12 was used simply because of its symbolic meaning.
Ancient Israel traced its lineage back to the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 sons of Jacob being the heads of the 12 tribes. It's possible then that this number 12 is symbolic of the new people of God who will enter into the kingdom when it comes.
But while many scholars insist that the Last Supper was a Passover meal, others question that assumption.
I don't really think that the Last Supper was a Passover. First of all, you don't have any of the actual rituals of the Passover. The Paschal Lamb, the telling of the story of Passover. None of that is in the description of the Last Supper. Jesus actually would have been crucified and in fact arrested on a Jewish holiday, which would be virtually impossible to believe.
The Gospels themselves are in disagreement. The accounts given by Mark, Matthew, and Luke place the dinner on Passover. The Gospel of John, however, sets it on the night before. If John's account is to be taken literally, Jesus is himself sacrificed on the Passover.
Basically, what that means is that John wants to say to us that Jesus is the Paschal Lamb. That's the way he understands the symbolism of Jesus and the death of Jesus.
With so many mysteries surrounding these few brief hours, scholars agree on one fact. Jesus was betrayed by one who sat at his own table. Did Jesus know by whose hand he would die? For the companions who dined together at the Last Supper, perhaps the most portentous meal in history, the atmosphere must have been tinged with sadness. Did they sense the stark reality of death so close at hand? Scholars have long wondered, how did Jesus and his disciples choose to spend these last few precious hours?
The biggest mysteries about the Last Supper, to me, are what really happened at that meal. Was this Jesus telling his disciples that he actually thought he was the Messiah, the Son of God?
What kind of brainstorming for the next phase of the Jesus movement was going on? All the conflicting motivations, dreams, and aspirations about what it meant to be Jewish. I would have loved to be there.
If I was a fly on the wall at the last gathering of Jesus, I would be very worried. I think what people would be talking about in such a situation, if they were at all wise, might well be how to get out of town as fast as possible.
Not only does Jesus foresee his own violent death, but he is soon to make an even more shocking disclosure.
While they were at the table eating, Jesus said, "I tell you that one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." And they began to be sorrowful, and to say unto him one by one, "Is it I?" Mark 14:19.
Even as his followers search their souls, is it possible that Jesus already knows the identity of his betrayer?
Woe unto that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It had been good for that man if he had not been born. Matthew 25:24.
In Jesus' time, Judas's act of betrayal would have been harshly punished.
Judas' offense is profound in terms of the social structure of the first century, where loyalty is the highest value. And so Judas' betrayal breaks the very social fabric. First of all, loyalty within a family was absolute. You defended family members to their death. And what the Jesus movement was saying is the bonds that we have, that we are creating among each other, are stronger than family bonds.
Then Judas, who betrayed him, said, "Surely not I, Rabbi." He replied, "You have said so." Matthew 26:25.
After this fateful confrontation with Judas, according to the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus takes up the remaining bread and distributes it among his disciples. This simple gesture will hold a profound meaning which will echo throughout the centuries. The disciples partake of the bread. Jesus reaches for a cup of red Passover wine. According to custom, it has been diluted, 2 parts of water to 1 of wine. He again offers thanks and passes the chalice among his disciples.
Jesus uses the moment in the breaking of the bread and the sharing of the cup to say this is what's going to happen to him. He's going to give his life, his body, and his blood, his very life, for the many.
With these few words, in which bread and wine are symbolically offered as the body and blood of Jesus, the sacrament of Holy Communion came into being. However, the story of the Last Supper in John's Gospel does not include this powerful ritual. Instead, it records another profound symbolic act, inexplicably omitted from the other three Gospels.
Jesus gets down on his knees like a slave, in fact, probably even like a woman slave, gets down on his knees and washes the feet of his disciples.
Jesus washing the feet is a kind of, on the one hand, submissiveness, but even more so, it seems to be symbolic of the passing on of the mantle of leadership.
What is the message that Jesus, with this simple act of humility, is attempting to convey?
And what Jesus says, you want to run this church? Here's how you do it. You are the servants of the people of God, and it's not poetry. It means getting down on your knees and washing people's feet.
The events between the night of the Last Supper and the day of the crucifixion would become known as the Passion of Jesus. Many have wondered what was in the mind of Jesus as he faced the terror of his own death. As Jesus steps into the cool of the spring night, he is aware that his death is close at hand. Followed by his disciples, he retreats into the seclusion of a tranquil garden on the Mount of Olives.
Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to them, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." Matthew 26:36.
How is Jesus able to cope with the agony of this moment? Distancing himself from his disciples, he falls to his knees and confronts his fear.
My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want. Mark 14:32.
This portrayal of Jesus is quite striking in its, shall we call it, psychological authenticity. The intent to really honor and be faithful to the human experience of fear, of uncertainty.
The clank of Roman weapons shatters the stillness of the night. Jesus looks up to see Judas approaching, and behind him a crowd carrying swords and clubs.
As soon as Judas arrived, he went up to Jesus and said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. So they arrested Jesus and held him tight. Mark 14:45.
Jesus is brought before the high priest Caiaphas, who charges him with advocating the destruction of the temple. Caiaphas sends him to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. It is Pontius Pilate who will decide his fate.
"Are you the king of the Jews?" he asked. "So you say," answered Jesus. Matthew 27:11.
One of the mysteries that surrounds Jesus' final days is that he never publicly proclaims himself to be King of the Jews. And yet he's arrested and tried and executed for calling himself King of the Jews.
Jesus is sentenced to death by crucifixion, the Romans' principal means of execution.
Crucifixion was a slow, torturous death. It was actually a death by asphyxiation. The prisoner who was being attached to the cross was nailed through the wrists rather than through the hands, as is commonly depicted. People could last as long as their strength held out. When their strength failed, their body would finally distend to such an extent they could no longer breathe.
As the tragic events unfolded, historians have wondered what happened to the individuals who shared the Last Supper with Jesus.
The evidence is that the male disciples, at least of Jesus, ran. I do not mock them for that. I think I probably would have done the same. But it's crucially important to distinguish between losing your nerve and losing your faith. It's one thing to run, and it's another thing to keep running. They didn't keep running, and that's what's important. They got out of town, but they didn't lose their faith.
And what of the 12th disciple who betrayed Jesus? According to gospel accounts, Judas dies by his own hand.
In Roman society, honor was the most important social value that any male could have. And for those who participated in political power and political authority, the loss of honor was very catastrophic. And the only way that the loss of honor could be redeemed was through suicide.
After the death of Jesus, the ritual from the Last Supper of sharing bread and wine was to be continued by his followers as a holy sacrament.
Early on in Christianity, we know that Christians got together weekly in order to celebrate the death and resurrection of Jesus, and did this with a community meal together, in which they would have a kind of a potluck supper.
Now, the earliest meaning of that Last Supper, or the Eucharistic meal, was a thanksgiving. The very name Eucharist, or Eucharistia, is the Greek word for thanks. And the bread that was blessed was called the thanked bread.
Historians now know that the earliest places of Christian worship were in the homes of converts to the faith.
For the first 3 centuries, Christian churches met in homes, house churches. And that meant they were in the domestic sphere. They were in the sphere that Roman society assigned to women and to women's authorities.
The age-old power struggle between men and women seems to have surfaced over the question of who should preside over the communal meal of the Eucharist.
We have indication that there were men who were quite upset with women ministering in churches at about the time the Gospels were written. And there was certainly a movement afoot in order to keep women silent in the churches by the end of the 1st century.
By the end of the 3rd century, worship was taken out of the home and moved to public reception halls called basilicas. Under the leadership of male priests, the meal disappears, and the elements of bread and wine become the central ritual.
What you have is that authority is now becoming attached to the person who presides over that Eucharistic meal. And then that becomes a way of separating the leadership from the rest of the people.
And so it was, from the simple sharing of a fellowship meal called the Eucharist, that over the centuries the rite of Holy Communion was to evolve. But above all, the most pervasive impact that the Last Supper has had on the lives of millions upon millions has been the understanding of the new covenant with God that Jesus was proposing.
The Last Supper takes the entire life of Jesus, with all its emphasis on the open table and the eating together, and encapsulates the life and the death of Jesus together at a meal. The Eucharist is food. In Christianity forever, the central rite of Christianity is food distributed equally to all.
From the humble breaking of bread in Jesus' time would come food to sustain the soul and the body. And if the vision of Jesus was ever to be fulfilled, perhaps a day would someday come when for all humanity, hunger of the body, as well as hunger of the spirit, would finally be only a distant memory.